Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to thank the leadership of the Iranian American community who organized this event and salute their efforts for education, both for lawmakers and the public in general. Just came back from a meeting in Paris. It was a fantastic event. I, for the first time, who have been part of similar events for the last 10, 20 years, have never seen former prime ministers, former ministers, lawmakers, heads of democratic movements in the Arab world sitting next to each other. When we left in Iraq at the end of 2011, early 2012, we were supposed to leaving Iraq to a coalition of various Iraqis. But the public, many politicians, leaders, of course, parts of the administration realized that Maliki was not really the prime minister of all of Iraq, maybe on paper. He was the prime minister of the pro-Iranian forces inside Iraq. It is now coming to reality. Another shock is happening is the extent of Iranian presence in Iraq. We know that the allies of the Iranians, Hezbollah and others, have been present, but to see that there are about 2 divisions inside Iraq, and one at least manned by Al-Quds, to see that now the Iranians are training the Iraqis' presence, and to see also that the Iranians have been using Iraq actually as a bridge from Iran into Syria to support the Assad regime, and from Syria into Lebanon to support Hezbollah, it is something that has to be revised and addressed. Last but not least, the reason for why we failed, let me say it clearly, in containing the Iranian influence in Iraq, in containing the fact that the jihadists rose because of the failure of the Maliki government and governance, well, that has to do also with our failure, international failure and American failure, in understanding what were the long goals of the Iranian regime. So let me move to the strategic mistakes we made since 2003, because that was the time where we were in Iraq. And being in Iraq, we could have driven Iraq or helped Iraqis to drive their country and politics in one or the 2 directions. Now here's the big deal. There was Ashraf camp. And I know there has been a lot of discussions about what is Ashraf. Ashraf is not just a collection of individual dissidents who gathered there because they fled the Iranian regime. It's more than that, because if they wanted to flee, they would have gone to Sweden or here or Australia. One of the reasons, the philosophical, political, strategic reason, and that was not well understood by the various bureaucracies that dealt with Ashraf, it was to stay as close as possible to Iran, as an island of freedom, where they could show the Iranian people first what would be another Iran. That was the challenge. That was really the mission of Ashraf, precisely because the MK in Ashraf was the antidote and the other side of Iran. It was inspiring thousands of Iranians. I was surprised yesterday in my meeting with the leaders of the movement that 120,000 members of this movement were executed in Iran over the past decades. 120,000. That's as many people who were killed in Syria. That's very significant. The positive side, or the bright side of Ashraf, is that it organized civil society, Iranian civil society, with arts and music, with democratic expression. People in Iraq would visit Ashraf as an oasis of how political life should be in the region. Ashraf probably was the only place where it could reflect a level of civilization, at least in politics and in culture, if I'm not extreme in that statement, until the Arab Spring. If I was a decision maker at the time, I would have created or helped Iranian exiles to create 10 Ashrafs. That was the Iran that we wanted to see ready to move into Iran when a shock will begin in Iraq, and it did start in 2009. So in 2009, and that was the essence of my remark, when 1.5 to 1.8 million Iranians walked on the streets of Tehran and other cities, by the way, 60% of them were under the age of 20. But we should have empowered them to become what de Gaulle was to the resistance of France when under Nazi occupation, meaning the force that could, once there is a change in Iran, be organized enough to help in changing that regime, because that should have been our policy. Between 2009 and 2011, the end of 2011, that was a critical moment. There was a letter sent by President Obama to the Grand Ayatollah Khamenei in 2009, in June of 2009, which declared actually an intention of engagement, So very few at the time observers understood that this is a real shift in American foreign policy. Now, in 2011, the critical moment was we left Iraq before we do two things. Number one, leaving Iraq in the hands of a coalition of moderates. We leave Iraq into the hands of a government headed by Mr. Maliki, who is a strategic ally of the Iranian regime. If we don't understand that phenomenon, then we can't understand much of what has been happening in Iraq. And the problem has been between 2011 till now, in non-understanding what was happening, is when you leave a country's central authorities and governments in the hands of a faction, if it's a political faction allied to the Iranian regime, what do you think they're going to be doing? They're going to definitely increase that Iranian influence inside Iraq. They're going to help the Iranian regime send weapons to Bashar al-Assad. They're going to continue to send those weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iranian regime supporting Maliki in getting rid of the enemies of the Iranian regime inside Iraq. So some among us, including high-level observers and analysts in this town, have been arguing that Maliki has been taking care of or marginalizing his own enemy. In Baghdad, the current government is unable to actually solve the problem. So there need to be a coalition of moderates, of Shia who have been marginalized, of Sunni who have been marginalized, of Kurds who have been pushed against, and of other minorities. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thanks to you folks for sticking it out this afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about two things. The first has to do with the Iranian-American community and the MEK, and by association, the people who are now at Camp Liberty. A lot of you young folks may not know the degree and the extent to which the Iranian-American community is supported by a number of distinguished Americans, our own citizens. And I'm not going to drop names, and without benefit of list, I'll simply tell you that pretty much starting at the top, there's a former vice presidential candidate, a former Speaker of the House, probably a dozen or so former senators and congressmen, about an equal number of former ambassadors, an attorney general, a former director of the FBI, 3 or 4 former state governors, 3 or 4 former chairmen of the JCS, about that many former service chiefs, the distinguished members on the panel today, and it goes on and on. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States of America made a promise. I was on the ground when we made the promise to the people who were finally assembled at Camp Ashraf. There were some in my sector, there were some elsewhere, but they were assembled at Camp Ashraf. There were no weapons inside that compound. And we did so, again, with a promise. We, the United States of America, by extension the United States military, will protect you. That promise has fallen on hard times to conduct their bloodletting. And that has simply raised the ire of a number of those people I talked to you about, saying, hey, we made a promise. It's a legal document. And yet we're doing nothing as these types of things are taking place under this Maliki government. I personally believe, and I think a lot of my contemporaries do, that the MEK and the things that the professor talked about that happened in 2009 are maybe our last best chance to solve what is perhaps our most significant problem in the Middle East. You can argue extremism or Iran. It's almost a toss-up these days in particular. But Iran is headlong in the pursuit of nuclear weapons. What are our options there? Well, there are a few, but none of them are really very good. We can continue with negotiations, but I think everybody that knows their history sees where this is going. I call it the North Korean model. The last best option in my mind is change from within. And I agree, I'm afraid, with the professor. We probably missed that boat when it sailed in 2009. But I also suggest that it's not completely gone. I can't imagine that the average citizen in Iran is happy with their government. They're certainly suppressed. They're jailed. They're executed in some cases if they become too vocal. But where that spirit burns, I think it's real. And I think you see it manifested outside the country in the MEK at these rallies that take place and elsewhere, where people simply want to have a non-nuclear representative government in the great state of Iran that can, in some better way, rejoin the world community. So those are the reasons, I think, that people support the Iranian-American community and would like to see a much better evolution than frankly, what we're faced with today. But we don't give up the effort. Okay, in terms of the situation in Iraq, is the survival of the Maliki government a vital national objective for the United States? I certainly hope not, because in my mind, that government simply needs to go away for something much more inclusive and representative. Is the establishment of a caliphate between Iraq and Syria a vital national interest, i.e. a national threat? Absolutely. We and the rest of the Western world, I don't believe, can let that happen. I don't think the Arab world can let that happen. That Sunni tribal leadership doesn't believe for a moment in the extremist ideologies. They have sampled the good life. They don't want to go back to 11th through 15th century laws that would govern their people. If we're going to do something, in my mind, the first thing is the Maliki government needs to go away. And there needs to be some indication that it is a cohesive and collective government that is there for the good of all the Iraqi people. Thank you.
I think it's clear from all of our speakers, and this is why we're doing this event here in Congress, is that the United States faces threats of unprecedented dimension, given the recent developments in Iraq, Syria, and Iran, and the region, if we don't confront the regime in Iran. There is no prospect for peace, for progress, for stability in the region if we give the Iranian regime a free hand to make trouble in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Gaza. And therefore, instead of appeasing the clerical regime with sanctions relief and trying to get a nuclear deal, we should be confronting them in a number of ways. First and foremost, by supporting a responsible, democratic, credible opposition. Fact of the matter is, there is serious dissension, serious unrest, and serious dissatisfaction within Iran with the leadership that they have been burdened with for over 30 years. And second of all, outside of Iran, and both inside of Iran, there is a credible organization that helps channel that dissent, which is the NCRI, or the Mujahideen al-Khalq, the symbol of which is Ashraf and liberty, which we've talked about. And, you know, as the person who announced protected person status for these people by the United States government, it is painful for me to see the abdication by the United States of their responsibility towards these individuals by not bringing an end to their captivity in liberty and not providing them the protection they deserve. So as we talk about next steps, let's bear in mind the importance of focusing our attention on Tehran and what we as a country can do in leading the Iranian people and the region to a more peaceful future by trying to contain and confront and roll back an aggressive, destabilizing, dangerous regime.